She thought she was just searching for silence. But deep in the forest, Sophia uncovered the burned remains of her family's past, and a truth that powerful people tried to erase. What she found hidden beneath the ashes will change everything. Stay until the end. And if you believe the past should never be silenced, subscribe, like, and share this story. The air was sharp and thin that morning, the kind that sliced into your lungs and made every breath feel deliberate. Sophia Johnson tightened the straps of her worn canvas backpack, her dark fingers trembling slightly from the cold. She had been driving for 3 days without a real destination, following back roads and faded maps across the Pacific Northwest. But in truth, she wasn't searching for a place. She was searching for silence. A silence that might numb the ache still clawing at her chest since her mother died. For 32 years, Sophia had lived a small, careful life. She was a teacher in a modest elementary school in Atlanta, the kind of woman who spent her days surrounded by chalk dust, paper airplanes, and the laughter of children. But when her mother, Emily, died suddenly from a heart attack, that laughter turned into a cruel echo. Every classroom bell felt heavier, every lesson harder to speak aloud. It was as if grief had carved out a hollow space inside her, one she could neither fill nor escape. So she did the only thing that made sense. She left. Her car eventually carried her into the heart of northern Oregon, where the forests were ancient and unyielding, and the roads narrowed into gravel paths swallowed by towering pines. Locals she met along the way spoke of an old cabin deep in the woods, a place burned decades ago under mysterious circumstances. They said no one ever rebuilt it. No one even went near it. People spoke of the land as if it carried a curse, or perhaps a memory too painful to disturb. Sophia hadn't planned to look for it. But grief has a strange gravity, pulling you toward the places you never meant to go. That was how she found herself now, standing at the edge of a forgotten trail, her boots sinking into damp moss as the morning sun broke weakly through a canopy of cedar branches. The woods around her were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed with things unsaid. After half an hour of walking, the trees parted suddenly, and Sophia stumbled into a clearing. That was when she saw it. The cabin, or what was left of it. Its charred remains rose from the forest floor like a skeleton half swallowed by the earth. Blackened beams jutted upward like broken ribs, and the ground was littered with rusted nails and cracked stones, half buried beneath decades of moss and fallen leaves. A faint, ghostly smell of smoke still lingered in the air, even after all those years. Or maybe that was just her mind, trying to fill in the silence. Sophia froze at the edge of the clearing, her chest tightening. She didn't know why, but something about this place felt familiar, almost intimate, as though the land itself had been waiting for her. For a long time, she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the remains of a life that had been burned away before she was even born. Finally, something inside her urged her forward. Her boots crunched over brittle fragments of charcoal and ash. The air grew heavier the closer she stepped to the ruins, and she felt her pulse quicken as if she were trespassing on sacred ground. She reached out and brushed her gloved hand across one of the beams. It was dry and brittle beneath her touch, flaking apart into fine black dust that clung stubbornly to her fingers. "This place," she whispered under her breath, but the words died before they formed. Inside, the cabin was no more than a hollow shell. The floor had caved in at several points, and stubborn weeds pushed their way through the cracks, claiming what the fire had tried to erase. Shafts of cold light pierced through the gaps in the collapsed roof, illuminating fragments of what had once been a home, A bent iron hinge, the shattered remains of a cast iron stove, a rusted spoon. Ghosts of a life long gone. Sophia swept her flashlight slowly across the space, not expecting to find anything. But then something caught her eye, a glint of metal beneath the collapsed timber in the far corner. She stepped carefully over the uneven floor, crouched down, and brushed away the soot and dirt. There, half buried and fused with the earth, was a small iron-bound chest. Its surface was warped and blackened from the heat, but it was still intact. Her heart thundered as she pulled at it. The chest groaned in protest, as if reluctant to give up its secrets, but after several minutes of effort, it finally came loose. The lock had melted long ago, so she was able to pry it open with shaking hands. Inside, nestled among the ashes, was a single item. A book, a diary. Its leather cover was scorched and curled at the edges, but somehow it had survived. Sophia stared at it, hardly daring to breathe. She lifted it gently from the chest, brushing away flakes of soot as though it were a sacred relic. It felt warm in her hands, though she knew that was impossible. For a moment, she just sat there on a blackened beam, holding it against her chest. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink smudged in places but still legible. The first entry read, April 6th. They told us to leave. But how could I abandon the place my grandfather built with his bare hands? The woods have always kept us safe. The fire will not be an accident. I know it in my bones. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a random journal. It was a warning, a testimony. She turned the page. April 10th. The nights are colder now. I hear voices in the trees. They are not neighbors. They're watching us. I fear for Emily. She does not understand why we keep the lamps off. Emily. Sophia froze. Her mother's name. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the page. Could it be a coincidence? Or was this connected, somehow, impossibly, to her own family? She flipped through the diary, scanning each entry with growing urgency. April 14th. They said they would return for the box. I refused. It does not belong to them. It belongs to us. But if they come back, I don't know if I'll be strong enough. Sophia's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the book. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy. This wasn't just someone's diary. This was her family's story, a story no one had ever told her. The final entry that remained intact was scrawled hastily, the ink darker as if written in panic. April 17th. They have come. The smoke is rising. If anyone finds this, know that the fire was not the end. The truth is buried deeper than these walls. Sophia stared at the words, her heart breaking open. The wind howled through the hollow frame of the cabin, stirring ashes that no longer burned. She pressed the diary to her chest, a sob escaping before she could stop it. Her mother had never spoken about her childhood. Whenever Sophia asked, Emily would smile faintly, change the subject, and tuck the sadness away. Now, in the ruins of a forgotten home, Sophia understood. The silence had been a shield. And this place, this burned cabin, was more than a tragedy. It was a witness, a graveyard of memories that someone had tried to erase. She wiped her eyes, closed the diary gently, and pressed it against her heart. She had come here searching for silence, but what she had found instead was a voice that had waited decades to be heard. And for the first time since her mother's death, Sophia felt the stirrings of something beyond grief. Purpose. The truth had survived the flames, and it had survived for her. That night, she didn't sleep. She pitched her tent near the clearing, the diary beside her like a heartbeat. The forest outside was quiet, but it was no longer a comforting quiet. It was watchful, tense, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Sophia lay awake, staring at the stars through the thin fabric of her tent, and realized that her life had just changed forever. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning. The ashes had spoken, and now she would listen. By dawn, the clearing wore a thin veil of frost, the ash glittering like a field of black snow. Sophia rose stiff from a night of half-sleep and breath, the diary tucked inside her jacket as if warmth alone could keep its words alive. The sun sifted softly through cedar and fir, drawing long bars of light across the ruins. She stepped into them like a diver into cold water and felt the same shock, a bracing, inevitable plunge. She opened the diary again, not because she had missed anything, but because something in her needed to hear the voice once more. The pages rasped like leaves. Emily. The name sat on the paper with a quiet audacity as if it had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Her mother's name. Not only the sound of it, but the angle, the way the hand that wrote it pressed harder on the M, as if the letter were holding something in place. Sophia tried her mother's face against her memory, those soft, careful eyes that dodged questions by looking toward the window, the way she folded dish towels so precisely, every corner squared. Emily, who, when asked about childhood, would say, "It was simpler then," and then redirect to homework, to dinner, to tomorrow. Now the silence rearranged itself into meaning. It had not been distance. It had been a gate. Wind moved across the clearing and set a charred beam to creaking. Sophia followed the sound. The beam had slumped against what might have once been the back wall, pinning a mound of ash and splintered plank beneath its weight. Something had glinted there the night before, a flash lost to dusk. In daylight, the flash returned, duller now, stubborn, like the last coin buried in a palm. She crouched and brushed aside the ash. It came up in gray clouds that clung to her gloves and sleeves. The thing beneath revealed itself by degrees, a metal corner, a seam, the scar where a handle had been, a box. Not large, no wider than her ribcage, no thicker than a good book, but heavy with the gravity of objects that were never meant to be left behind. She wedged the tip of her camp trowel under the edge and levered gently, rocking the beam until the box slipped free with a cough of soot. The latch was fused with rust. Sophia worked it with the flathead of her multi-tool, the metal wincing, then giving with a sharp, intimate snap. She held her breath and lifted the lid. Inside, cloth. Singed and stiff, the weave melted into a brittle skin. She unfolded it carefully, as one might unwrap a child's keepsake. Pages rustled. No, not pages. Rectangles, photographs. They were black and white, edges scalloped the way old prints often are, their whites now the warm color of tea. The first was a front porch portrait, a woman in a calico dress, a strong jaw, hair wound tight, a man with broad shoulders and suspenders, two children on the step, the smaller girl with her knees angled together, as if taught to hold herself inside the space of her own body. The cabin in the background was whole, shyly proud, the siding clean, the window panes catching a sliver of sky. Sophia felt her knees go to water. She sat back on her heels and slid another photograph from the cloth. This one caught the same woman laughing, head tilted, hand lifted to shield her eyes from the sun. In her other hand, an apple. A toddler reached for it, braids tied with string bows. The toddler's face was bright, intent, the concentration of small children who consider reaching a kind of work. Sophia had seen that expression before. On the first day of school each year, when children wrote their names on desk tags. On one particular child, in a particular picture frame on her mother's dresser, Emily at 5, braids slightly crooked despite someone's careful effort, grin showing the dark space of a lost front tooth. The print on the dresser had been studio neat. This one was cedar rough, the light honest and unarranged, yet the curve of the cheek, the set of the mouth, a rhyme across time. She thumbed the bottom edge and noticed in the thin margin a pencil mark, EJ 1949. The handwriting was different from the diary, more upright, the J curling like a hook. Her throat tightened. She drew another photo, winter. Snow piled like folded sheets along the porch rail, smoke rising from the stovepipe in a clean white ribbon. The family clustered in coats, wool too thin for the depth of the season. The man had his hand on the older child's shoulder, the gesture casual and protective. A dog stared toward the photographer, ears pricked. Behind them, the same door, the same two windows blinking like square eyes in a wooden face. Sophia laid the photos in a slow fan on the blackened floorboards where light could find them, then pulled the cloth's final fold apart. Underneath, paper, but not photographs. A page that had once been part of something thicker, neatly torn along one side. The print at the top read quitclaim deed. Below it, names. Below those, a legal description of land most people would only know by walking it. The bottom edge was charred away, signatures blurred to a smear. The surviving part was enough to say one thing clearly. Someone had tried to relay this land to someone else. Or tried to refuse. Sophia felt the pulse in her neck beat against her scarf. She set the deed fragment gently beside the photos and reached again into the box. Her fingers found a small tin, hinged, oval, the sort that might have once held mints. Inside, 3 buttons, 2 brass and 1 mother of pearl, and a cut-down key whose teeth were filed blunt. Even the small things felt curated by urgency. You do not save what you do not mean to prove. She closed her eyes and let her breath out slowly. The forest had drawn closer while she worked. At least, that was how it felt, the hush thickening the moment as if even the trees understood the ritual of it. When she opened her eyes again, the ruin was not only ruin, it was a room reassembled by memory. She found herself thinking of the family album her mother had kept in the hallway closet, a thick, blue-bound book whose pages stuck to each other in humid summers. There had always been a seam in the story, 3 pages missing, the adhesive ghosts of photos long removed. When Sophia was 9, she had asked why they were gone. Her mother, closing the closet, had said, "They weren't good ones." It had seemed a sufficient answer then. Now, the space where those pages once lived yawned like a door swinging open. She lifted the photo of the laughing woman and felt, with a physical jolt, the familiarity of those eyes. They were not her mother's exactly. They were the kind of eyes that built mothers, watchful, quick to narrow against glare, alight with a fire that was both courage and caution. Grandmother, she thought, the word rising before she could argue with it. She turned the photo over. On the back, faint and nearly erased, a line of pencil. May on the porch, harvest day. The M was the same as in the margin, curled, insistent. May, Sophia whispered. A name made of one clean sound, and yet it broke in her mouth. She eased the photos back into their cloth and sat for a while in the frost-sour air, listening to a woodpecker knock a riddle into the far trees. Her own name sounded different in her head now, as if the syllables had been weighed with a new metal. Sophia Johnson, daughter of Emily Johnson, granddaughter, perhaps, of May, who laughed with an apple in her hand and wrote about a fire she knew was coming. She did not let herself stand until she had looked over the ground with the slow attention of a conservator. Grief, she thought, had taught her a kind of clumsy speed. This story would require steadiness. She returned the keepsakes to the box, the photos wrapped again in their burn-scarred cloth, the deed fragments slid flat beneath them, the buttons and key nested back into their tin. The box's weight felt different in her hands now. It was no longer a relic. It was evidence. A small path, barely a thought in the grass, veered from the clearing toward the north. She hadn't noticed it yesterday. Perhaps it had always been there, or perhaps her eyes were only now tuned to the geometry of the place. She followed it a few steps and found the earth dipping into a shallow trench, what might once have been a root cellar or a trash pit. The ash was deeper here, and when she worked her trowel into it, she found glass, the lip of a jar, the body blown out by heat. She turned over a shard and read an embossed fraction. 3/4. Nothing you would show a reporter. Everything you would recognize if it had been yours. Sophia returned to the collapsed wall and sat on a crossbeam, the diary open again on her lap. She read the April entries slowly, resisting the urge to rush to the last page. She let the handwriting teach her the shape of the days it came from. A woman measuring night by the sound of footsteps that did not belong to neighbors. A mother shielding a child from lamps that must not be lit. A home held against a pressure that increased as surely as snow accumulates on a roof. They said they would return for the box. The line shivered through her like a string plucked low. If this was the box, they had returned. They had returned and found a refusal. Sophia looked at the doorframe, or what remained of it, a rectangle of negative space, the idea of a boundary whose wood had been erased. She imagined May standing there while the men on the other side tried to soften their threats to something that could be mistaken for negotiation. She imagined the child, Emily, watching from behind the curtain, a small hand caught in fabric, the pattern imprinted on skin. The forest made a sound like a breath. Sophia flinched, then steadied. "It was you," she said softly to the room that was no longer a room. "This was you." The confession, if confession was what it was, unlocked a memory she had not invited. A summer afternoon in Atlanta, heat making a trembling mirage over the street, her mother rinsing greens in the sink, radio low, station fuzzed by weather. The newsreader reported on a fire in a distant county. Suspected arson, an official said into a microphone. Her mother had shut off the faucet so quickly the pipes knocked, then stood motionless, the water still running from the colander, the leaves wilting under it. "Some fires are set to erase," Emily had said, as if to the sink, as if to no one. Then she had turned the radio louder, then off again, then back on, and finally changed the station to music. Sophia had been 13, perplexed by the choreography. She understood it now. It was a dance you learned when your body remembered heat. Her stomach pinched and reminded her she had not eaten. She took a granola bar from her pack and broke it into careful bites, the way one eats at a wake, as if noiselessness could honor the dead. Between bites, she sketched in her notebook a rough outline of the cabin's footprint, the location of the beam where she had found the box, the angle of the sun at this hour. The teacher in her persisted even here, in doubt and ash. Documentation was love-shaped like patience. When she finally slid the box into her pack, zipping it under the spare sweater and the coil of paracord, she felt the forest lean back slightly, as if saying, "All right then. We see you're not here to pillage." She rose and circled the clearing once more, tracing with her eyes what life might have looked like when it was ordinary. Someone chopping wood where the stump still stood. Someone mending a fence where a line of stones held the suggestion of order. Someone kneeling to plant in the rectangle where the soil was looser, richer, darkest. At the eastern edge, the ground dipped toward a creek bed, mostly stones now with a ribbon of water threading through. There, against the bank, she found a bent spoon and the belly of a blue glass bottle, its color unshamed by time. She set both back where they lay. The urge to keep everything felt like greed masquerading as reverence. Better, she thought, to take only what spoke and leave the rest to speak where it was. Her watch told her it was scarcely past 10. The day was opening. She could have gone back to the car then, driven to town, found a library, a clerk, a map drawer, followed paper trails until a clerk brought boxes to a table and said, "Records are incomplete. You understand, there was a fire." Instead, she stayed. The clearing had not finished saying what it had to say. The diary had warned. The photos had testified. But the hinge she felt turning belonged to her, and hinges require time. She sat again and read the diary from the beginning, slower still, mouth forming the words silently as if to fix them in the room. She noticed things she had missed before, the way the writer, May, she named her without proof, shifted between we and I, as if the act of recording alternately summoned the family and isolated the mother within it. The way the entries grew shorter as the dates neared the end, as if breath itself were being rationed. In the margin, beside April 14th, a small grease smear had darkened the paper. She touched it with the pad of her finger and imagined sausages cooked in a cast-iron pan, or the slick left by a thumb pressed to a hinge. Evidence does not only speak in ink, she reminded herself. It speaks in stains and weights and omissions. A jay screamed from a cedar and snapped the thread of her concentration. She looked up, nerves suddenly ringing. The sound of the forest returned in layers she could count. Water under stone, a squirrel scolding, wind threading needles through the needles of fir. And beneath all of it, something she could not name. Not absence, not presence. A category of listening that put her skin on alert. The diary page moved with her breath. She closed the book and held it a moment, a binding against her palm, and made a decision that felt less like a choice than a recognition. She would not take this back to a desk and bury it in private. She would learn the names properly. She would let the voice speak aloud in rooms that still had 4 walls. She did not know yet how to do that. She only knew what it would not look like. It would not look like silence. The light swung warmer. Sap loosened in the wounded trees and released a smell like honeyed turpentine. Sophia slipped the diary into her pack beside the box and stood, dusted frost from the ankles of her jeans, and tested the weight on her shoulders. Heavier. True. The heaviness steadied her. She lingered at the threshold, at the place where the door had been, and let her fingers float through air that once held a latch. Her mind performed the simple magic of rebuilding, pane to pane, plank to plank, breath to breath. She imagined sweeping this floor. She imagined shelling peas at this step. She imagined the moment a woman, her grandmother, understood the danger would not turn aside, and folded a small body, Emily, into her arms, and held on hard enough to leave a mark that could travel a lifetime. Sophia turned toward the trees. The path by which she had come looked narrower now, as if frail compared to the work ahead. She walked it anyway, each step an argument with the part of her that wanted to run. At the edge of the clearing, she paused and looked back. The cabin's ribs made a dark geometry against a sky clearing to a hard blue. She lifted her hand, a small and private salute. That was when she heard it. Faint, distinct, the crush of frost under a footfall that was not hers. She did not move at first. Often the forest rehearses this trick, makes your own sound return to you a half-beat late as if to test your nerves. She waited for the echo to align with her breath. It did not. Another step came, a careful one, the weight set down in a way that said the walker knew how sound travels. Sophia's heart migrated upward, lodging high and animal in her throat. She did not call out. She reached for the edge of a cedar and found the rough bark with her palm, grounding herself in its furrowed certainty. The diary and her pack seemed to warm against her spine as if to say, "Listen." She listened. The step did not come again. Only a jay, unfazed, scolded the sky. She exhaled through her nose and felt the shiver leave her in a slow wave. Maybe it had been a deer, skirting the black tooth of the ruin. Maybe it had been the forest itself, shifting its weight. Or maybe she refused to dress the thought in shapes yet. The world is always listening when you start to speak the truth. Sometimes it answers with another voice. Sophia stepped back into the clearing, not toward the sound, but toward the center, where the last square of floor still held. She stood there a final time that morning, turned a slow circle, and let the room fix itself inside her. When she left, she would carry it as precisely as the photos carried their moments. She would carry it in a way that could be handed to others. She adjusted the pack, touched the beam where the box had been hidden, a benediction, a promise, and started down the path toward the road and the small town beyond. The sun was higher now, thawing the frost and releasing the damp green scent of living things. Behind her, the clearing settled. At the first bend, she paused again, not to look back, but to touch the diary through the canvas, the way you touch a shoulder you love. "I hear you," she said. The words felt right in the mouth, like the beginning of a lesson well prepared. The sound came once more then, farther off, not threatening, but undeniable, a presence assembling itself beyond the trees. She walked on, the hinge already turning toward the next door. The small town at the base of the valley looked ordinary enough. Rows of weathered, clapboard houses, a gas station with a single pump, a diner with fogged-up windows and a hand-painted sign that read Cedar Grove Cafe. But as Sophia Johnson stepped through its narrow streets with the weight of the diary pressing against her back, she felt anything but ordinary. Every street light, every passing truck, every curious glance from the townsfolk seemed to belong to the same hidden story she had stumbled into. She hadn't planned to come into town. Her original intention was to study the diary in solitude, maybe contact a historian or a librarian. But the pages she'd read the night before refused to stay silent. Each entry felt like a whisper demanding to be heard, a call not just for answers, but for justice. She knew she needed help. And deep down, she also knew she couldn't carry this truth alone. The diner was nearly empty when she pushed the door open, the bell above it chiming with a tired, metallic note. A woman in her 60s, gray hair tucked beneath a red bandana, looked up from behind the counter and offered a polite but distant smile. Sophia took a seat in the corner booth, her hands still cold despite the coffee she wrapped them around. It wasn't long before someone noticed the diary. The man at the counter, late 50s, face creased by years of sun and hard work, kept glancing over his shoulder, his gaze darting from Sophia's face to the scorched leather cover resting on the table. Finally, he turned in his seat. "You found that up there, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Sophia froze. "Up where?" He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at her, his eyes sharp and searching, as if he were trying to decide whether she was a threat or a ghost. "The cabin," he said finally. "Nobody goes there. Not anymore." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But then she thought about the man's words in the diary. If anyone finds this, know that the fire was not the end. If her family had been silenced by fear, Perhaps that silence had spread further than she realized. "Yes," she said finally, "I was there." The man turned back toward the counter, but the diner had gone still. Even the waitress stopped mid-step, a half-poured cup of coffee trembling in her hand. "You shouldn't have gone there," the man said. "Some places were meant to be left alone." "Why?" Sophia asked. His jaw tightened. "Because everyone who did never came back the same." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Never came back the same. It wasn't just superstition. Something had happened here, something people still feared, even after all these years. Later that afternoon, she found herself standing inside the town's small library, the kind of place that smelled like dust and forgotten time. The librarian, a thin woman named Grace, greeted her warmly and offered her a table. Sophia spread out the diary, the charred photographs, and the warped metal box she had found. Grace's breath caught when she saw the faces in the photos. "I haven't seen them in decades," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the images. "That was the family who lived up in that cabin." "Do you know what happened to them?" Sophia asked. Grace hesitated, glancing toward the empty doorway as if to make sure no one was listening. "All anyone ever said was that there was a fire. They were gone by morning, but—" She lowered her voice. "People used to whisper that it wasn't an accident, that someone wanted them gone." Sophia's chest tightened. "Do you know why?" Grace shook her head. "No one ever said. Or maybe they were too scared too. This town was different back then, quieter, more dangerous. Some things were handled without the law." Sophia pushed the diary toward her. "Then maybe this is the truth they tried to bury." Grace's eyes widened as she scanned the entries. "My dear, you can't keep this to yourself. People deserve to know. Families deserve to know." The weight of those words sank into Sophia's bones. This wasn't just her family's story anymore. It was a piece of history, a wound that still throbbed beneath the surface of this town. And if she kept it to herself, it would fester there forever. She spent the rest of the day in the library combing through old newspaper archives and town records. Most files from the 1940s and 50s were missing or incomplete, but one short article caught her eye. "Tragic fire claims lives of local family. Suspected accident." It was barely 3 paragraphs long. No names, no investigation, no follow-up. It was as if the family, her family, had never existed at all. By the time the library closed, the sky outside had turned to a bruised violet. Sophia checked into a small inn at the edge of town. That night, she sat by the window with a dim lamp burning low and opened a fresh notebook. At first, she only meant to jot down the details before they slipped away. But once she began writing, she couldn't stop. She wrote everything: the diary entries, the photographs, the old article, the whispers she had heard in the diner. And with every word, something shifted inside her. Grief had brought her here, but now something else was guiding her: purpose. She wasn't just chasing answers for herself anymore. She was fighting for voices that had been stolen, for names that had been erased. The next morning, Sophia returned to the diner. The same man in the plaid jacket was sitting at the counter, and the same faces turned toward her when she walked in. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She carried the diary openly in her hands. "I want to tell you something," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. The room fell silent. She opened the diary and began to read aloud. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger with each word. She read about nights without light, about strangers in the trees, about the box her grandmother refused to give up. She read about the fire and the truth. When she finished, the silence that filled the room was different. It wasn't fearful. It was reverent. "I remember them," an older woman whispered from the back. "I remember hearing the screams. No one ever believed me." The man at the counter nodded slowly. "We've all been carrying pieces of this in silence," he said. "Maybe it's time the silence ended." Sophia swallowed the lump in her throat. It was then she realized that what she had given them wasn't just a story. It was permission. Permission to remember. Permission to speak. That night, walking back to the inn beneath a sky scattered with stars, Sophia felt lighter than she had in years. The grief was still there. Grief never truly left, but it no longer weighed her down. It anchored her, strengthened her. She knew now that her family's story was not meant to stay buried in ashes. It was meant to rise, to be spoken aloud, to become part of something bigger. And for the first time since her mother's death, Sophia felt certain about her next step. She wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. She was a witness. And she would not let the silence win. The following weeks unfolded like a storm breaking after decades of stillness. What had started as a whisper in the diner grew into a current that rippled through Cedar Grove. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the subject now stopped Sophia in the grocery store, the post office, the library, anywhere they could speak in hushed tones about the night the fire consumed the cabin on the hill. The silence that had defined this town for generations was beginning to crack, and from the fractures poured stories, raw, painful, and long suppressed. Sophia listened to all of them. She carried a small recorder in her coat pocket and a worn notebook in her bag, documenting every detail. Some accounts were fragmented. A neighbor who remembered seeing 3 unmarked trucks on the road that night. A former deputy who swore the sheriff told everyone to forget what they saw. A woman who had been a child back then and still remembered the scent of smoke drifting into her bedroom window. Others were more direct. People who admitted they had known exactly what had happened but had been too afraid to speak. They were going to expose something, one elderly man said, his voice shaking as he stared at his coffee. Names, documents, things that would have destroyed powerful men in this town. So they made sure those papers burned, and with them, the people who held them. Each testimony was a thread, and Sophia was weaving them into a tapestry of truth. It was exhausting work, emotionally draining in ways she hadn't expected. Every interview peeled back a new layer of injustice. Every whispered confession added weight to the story she now carried. But with that weight came purpose, a fierce, steady fire that kept her moving forward. The town's interest reached a turning point one chilly evening when Sophia was invited to speak at the town hall. The building was small and creaked with age, its wooden floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. She stood at the front of the packed room, the diary clutched tightly in her hands. For a moment, she thought she might not be able to speak. Her throat was dry, her palms slick with sweat, but then she remembered her grandmother's handwriting. The way her words refused to die even when flames devoured the walls around them. "I didn't come here to accuse anyone," she began, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "I came here because the truth has been buried beneath ashes for too long. My family lived in that cabin. They were erased, not by accident, but by force, and I believe it's time their story was heard." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Some faces were pale with shame, others were wet with tears. Sophia opened the diary and read aloud, just as she had in the diner, but this time her words carried the weight of witnesses, evidence, and memory. She read about the threats, the fear, the fire, and when she was done, the room fell silent. An elderly man in the front row struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "I was there," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I saw the fire. I saw who started it, and I stayed quiet because I was afraid. But I'm not afraid anymore." His words broke the dam. Others stood and spoke, some crying, some shaken with anger, others trembling with relief. People confessed what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had chosen to forget. Names were spoken for the first time in decades. The truth was surfacing, and it was unstoppable. After the meeting, the local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "The Fire That Never Died." Soon, larger papers picked it up. Journalists arrived from Portland, Seattle, even Chicago. They interviewed Sophia, photographed the diary, and combed through the archives for evidence. What they found matched the testimonies: missing property records, sealed court documents, unexplained resignations, all from the same year the fire had burned her family's home to the ground. The renewed attention didn't please everyone. Sophia began receiving anonymous letters slipped under her hotel door. Some pleading with her to stop, others threatening her if she didn't. More than once, she noticed the same dark sedan parked across the street from the library where she worked late into the night. It was clear that the same forces that had silenced her grandmother were still watching, still hoping the truth would stay buried. But Sophia refused to be intimidated. "If they burned this place down to hide the truth," she told herself, "then I owe it to every person who suffered in silence to make sure it's seen." Her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She contacted civil rights lawyers and historical commissions. She filed requests for declassified documents. And most importantly, she reached out to families, Black families, Indigenous families, immigrant families, who had stories of their own, stories of homes burned, land stolen, names erased. To her astonishment, many of them traced their tragedies back to the same handful of men, the same system of power that had targeted her grandmother. The story had grown far beyond her family. It had become a mirror reflecting the painful truth of America itself, a truth that had been ignored, dismissed, or rewritten for far too long. Weeks later, Sophia returned to the clearing on the hill. The forest was quiet beneath a sky heavy with snow, and the ruins of the cabin were just as she had left them. But something felt different now. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was listening. It was waiting. She knelt in the ashes and opened the diary one last time. "You weren't silenced," she whispered to the pages. "They tried, but you're still speaking." As the wind stirred the pine branches overhead, Sophia felt something shift deep inside her. The grief that had once felt like a weight pressing her into the earth now felt like wings lifting her forward. She understood now that this was never just about the past. It was about the future. About building a world where truth could no longer be set on fire and forgotten. From that day on, Sophia was no longer seen as a grieving woman digging through old ashes. She was seen as a voice, powerful, unyielding, unstoppable, a witness for those who had been silenced, a storyteller for those who had been erased, a keeper of a truth that refused to die. And though she knew the fight ahead would not be easy, she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Once a story like hers was set free, it could never be burned away again. Spring arrived slowly in Cedar Grove, melting the last patches of snow and washing the hillsides in a soft green haze. For months now, Sophia Johnson had been working tirelessly, writing articles, recording testimonies, compiling documents, and speaking at community gatherings. The story of the burned cabin and the silenced family had spread far beyond the small town where it began. Newspapers had run features, historians had reached out for interviews, and advocacy groups had contacted her, eager to support her work. But even as the story grew larger, Sophia knew it was not finished. Not yet. She returned to the clearing one final time, the place where everything had begun. The forest greeted her with a hush, as if aware of the weight of this moment. The blackened beams still jutted from the earth like scars, but they no longer filled her with sorrow. Instead, they felt sacred, monuments to endurance, resilience, and truth. Sophia set her backpack down on the damp ground and opened it carefully. Inside were the items that had changed her life: the scorched diary, the bundle of photographs, the rusted key, and the torn deed. She laid them out gently, one by one, as if presenting offerings at an altar. "This isn't an ending," she whispered into the cool air. "It's a beginning." She sat cross-legged in the clearing, the diary resting on her lap, and began to write. Her pen moved with quiet determination, recording everything she had learned: the testimonies, the revelations, the evidence of corruption and cover-up. She wrote about the townsfolk who had found their courage to speak, about the generations who had suffered in silence, and about the power of memory to defy even the fiercest attempts to erase it. When she finished, she looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, painting the clouds with streaks of fire and gold, and for a moment she felt as though the forest itself was listening, not just to her words, but to the voices that had always been here, waiting to be heard. Sophia's work did not end with her writing. She took her story to courtrooms and public hearings, challenging officials to reopen investigations long declared closed. She presented evidence of stolen land, fraudulent transfers, and racially motivated violence that had been buried for generations. Some people resisted, claiming the past was too distant to matter, but Sophia always answered the same way. It matters because they mattered. And slowly, change began to stir. Land once stolen was restored to descendants. Historical markers were placed at the site of the cabin, acknowledging the injustice that had occurred there. Schools began teaching about the fire as part of local history. What had once been a story erased from memory was now a story everyone knew, and one they would never forget. Months later, Sophia stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium. Journalists, historians, activists, and families filled the seats, their faces turned toward her with anticipation. She spoke about her grandmother May and her mother Emily, about the fire that had stolen everything and the silence that had followed. She spoke about fear, how it had kept so many people quiet, and about courage, which had broken that silence at last, but more than anything, she spoke about memory. "Grief is not weakness," she told the audience, her voice steady and strong. "It is love that refuses to disappear, and when we choose to carry that love forward, when we refuse to let it be buried, it becomes something stronger. It becomes purpose." The room rose to its feet, applause echoing like thunder. Sophia felt tears burn in her eyes, but they were not the same tears that had once fallen in sorrow. These were tears of strength, of victory, of peace. On her last morning in Cedar Grove, Sophia returned once more to the clearing. The forest was alive with birdsong, and sunlight filtered gently through the branches. She walked slowly among the ruins, running her fingers along the charred beams one final time. "Thank you," she whispered, to her grandmother, to her mother, to the generations whose voices had guided her. She knew she would return here again, not as a seeker of silence, but as a bearer of truth. This place, this scarred, sacred ground, would always be part of her. It was the heart of her story, and through her it would live on. As she stepped back onto the trail, the weight on her shoulders felt different now. Not heavy, but grounding, like roots anchoring her to the earth. She had entered these woods as a grieving daughter. She left them as something more, a storyteller, a witness, a keeper of fire that no one could ever extinguish again. The forest behind her whispered softly, a chorus of voices carried by the wind, not ghosts to fear, but ancestors to honor. And as Sophia walked toward the horizon, the path before her glowed with the light of a new dawn, born from the flames of a past that refused to be forgotten. Some stories she knew now were too important to stay silent. And this, her story, their story, would never be silenced again. Some stories are too powerful to be buried, and Sophia's journey proves that truth always finds a way to rise from the ashes. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the past should always be remembered?